In this chapter, I will walk you through the prime basics such as loading the plugin, understanding the UI, and how the tools work. So first we start by loading the plugin in Maya. So in order to do that, we go to Settings and Preferences, Plugin Manager, and load Ornatrix. Loading the plugin creates a dedicated shelf and a menu bar icon for Ornatrix. In the Ornatrix shelf, you will find all the essential tools you would require to generate and groom the hair guides, while all the other tools required to refining the groom can be found in the menu bar icon. Now I'm going to demo the tools we will be using extensively moving forward in the workshop. To do so, I'm going to create a sphere. And I'm going to generate hair using add hair from the shelf. With the generation of hair, we can also see that Ornatrix has created a group of operators in the stack. The operator stack works similar to the layer stack in Photoshop. So you can rearrange an operator within the stack based on how you want it to influence the hair. So let's jump into our first operator, guides from mesh. But first, let me reduce the length of the hair real quick, just so we could see the mesh on which we generated the hair. And to do so, you can just go to guides and change the length from 50 to some smaller amount. As you can see, the width of the hair strands are so thick that it covers the entire surface of the sphere, so we cannot really see anything underneath it. In order to see the sphere, I'm gonna just jump into change width. I'm gonna reduce the width of the hair strand, and I'm gonna go to width ramp as well. And I'm gonna change the shape of the strand by changing the shape of the width ramp. The left side represents the base and the right represents the tip of the hair strand. So I'm gonna reduce the width of the root and I'm gonna change the shape in the middle. And there you go. Now you can see the sphere. And I'm gonna jump back into guides from mesh and I'm gonna reduce the hair strands even more. Length of the hair strands even more. This operator allows for the creation of guide hair based on the mesh shape. It plants the roots on the mesh and extrude the guides from every root based on the surface normal at the root origin. The user also has an option to plant the guides only in certain areas of the mesh, either by using material ID or distribution map. Although this isn't necessary since hair from guides is usually what ultimately defines the final result, which we will get to in a bit. Let's look into the options we have in here, starting with distribution type. This option helps you distribute the roots along the surface. The icons that we see in here gives you a picture representation of how the guides are distributed. And then we have random seed. This value shuffles the positions and randomizes lengths of resulting guides. Let's look into the options we have in here, starting with distribution type. This option helps you distribute the roots along the surface. And the icons that we see in here gives you a picture representation of how the guides are distributed. So we can just click on these icons based on what kind of distribution you want. So I'm going to go with random phase distribution. And then we have random seed. So what this does is that it randomizes the position and the lengths of the resulting guides. And then we have count. By default, it is set to 300, which means right now we have 300 guides generated and distributed along the surface of the sphere. The actual count of the guides does not have to match this number exactly, especially if a distribution map is used. The count is set to 300 by default, which means right now we have 300 guides distributed along the surface of the sphere. You can see the guides by clicking on Edit Guides. Those are all the guides that we have right now. Working with too many guides can also be a bit messy at times. So I'd like to reduce the number down to, say, maybe 20. So as you can see, we only have few guides now. Then we have distribution map, where you can connect a custom-made map to define where you want the guides to be distributed on the mesh. And then you have displacement offset, which allows you to push away the guides from the surface if needed. And then we have displacement map, which is used to vary displacement along the surface with a texture map. Say, for example, if you're having a creature or a character that has displacement on them, and if you want your hair guides and hair strands to follow that displacement, this is where you will be connecting your map to, so that the hair follows the displacement. And under guides, we have point count, length, and randomness. The point count is basically the number of vertices that you have on each guide. So the more vertices, the more detailed the guide shape can be. But I wouldn't really recommend going crazy with this number, because that could be heavy for a computer to compute when you start grooming, when you start combing the hair. And length, we already been through that. Like, you can increase the length of the hair and hair strands, hair guides using this length. So that's about it for guides from mesh, and let's move on to edit guides. This is the main hub for editing and managing the guides and hair strands. The shelf contains all the tools you would need to edit the guides, starting with create brush, and then you have delete brush, and then comb, cut, grab brush, and then you have grow and shrink, paint brush, pull brush, revert brush, and smooth brush. So I'm going to start with create brush, which basically creates new strands. So you can go into tool settings and you can adjust the size of the brush, strength, and I'm going to change the root count to 2, and also I'm going to change the spacing between them. As you can see, one click gives me 2 strands, and if I drag them, I get more of those strands. And you can also delete them by going into delete strands brush, and then you can just paint on the surface to delete the strands. And the comb is used for shaping your strands. In cases like this, when you see a sharp curve on a strand, you can just go to smooth brush, keep painting on it until you see the strand has a really nice curvature. You also have revert brush, which basically gets rid of any edit that you've done on the strand. So basically, if I do that, it takes it back to the position it was before I started grooming with the comb brush. If you want to change the length of the strands manually, you can grab the grow shrink brush, and you can just grab one of the strands and then just click on it and pull it. And when you do so, it is selecting one of the vertices on the strand, and it is just dragging from that point on to forward. And then we have pull brush, which basically is just grabbing the hair and pulling it the way we want. And then we have cut brush, which is used to trim the strands. And then we have 3 more tools on the shelf that we would be using a lot, which is draw strands, and then we have edit sinks and edit clumps. What draw strands does is if you're working on like eyebrows or beard or anything, and if you want your hair to be in certain way, you can use your own curve that you exported from ZBrush, or if you know the exact style or the way the hair needs to bend, you can just select this tool and draw on the surface and it will create a strand for you. I'm going to go back to guides from mesh and I'm going to set the count to 0. So the reason we see these 4 strands even though we set the count to 0 is because these are the 4 strands that we generated using create brush. So you can get rid of them as well using the delete brush. And then I'm going to select the draw brush. So when I'm trying to draw using this brush, you can see there is a distance between the icon of the brush and where the root of the brush is. The reason that's happening is because we scaled the sphere when we created it, but we did not freeze the transforms. It is following the surface of the initial scale of the sphere. So in order to get rid of this issue, I'm gonna quit from that tool. I'm gonna select the sphere. And I'm going to freeze transforms on it, which you can find by going to modify, freeze transforms. And now the tool follows the surface of the sphere like we want it to. So now you can just draw on the surface and you'll get the strand that you want. You can see the issue that I'm running into here is that when I draw a strand shape, it is penetrating through the surface and we basically can't see it. And there is an easy fix for that. So under edit guides operator, there is an option that says push away from the mesh. So you can just click on it. And it only works on the strand that is selected. So I'm going to select the other strand. And to do so, you can go to edit strands brush, select the strand that I want, and then push away from the surface. There you go. And then we have edit sinks. I think it would be better if we get back to this tool once we start grooming our character. The other most important option that I find really helpful in edit guides is actually grouping the guides. So if you go to strand groups, this is where you can actually group your strands so that you can just apply the operators or any kind of effects to the hair based on the groups. In order to do that, check the use strand groups option and then also set the display strand groups, because what that does is it assigns a different color for each group that we create. So I'm going to go back to edit strands brush, and I'm going to select the strands that I want to group. And then I'm going to hit assign unique, because by default all the strands are set to 0. So by default all the strands are grouped under 0. I'm going to select the strands that I want to group and I'm going to hit either assign. You can give a unique number if you want to and hit assign, or you can just use assign unique. As you can see, it changed the color of that group. And then I'm going to select a few more, assign unique, a couple more here, assign unique, and that. There you go. So if I hit next, it scrolls through all the groups. So now that we have the groups assigned, we can assign a different effect for each group. So I'm going to create curl operator here. I'm going to put it above hair from guides. Under strand groups, I'm going to assign that to group 1. So now it only assigns that effect to that group. Reduce the magnitude. And then I'm going to create frizz. And I'm going to assign that to group 2. And so on. So that's why I prefer using groups when I'm trying to groom something that's more complex. So if you look at the reference photo here, you can see how different the hair is on the face, on the ears, and as it transitions from the face to the neck. In cases like this, I would usually group all of my strands on the face into one group and ears and neck into two other groups and then deal with them separately. And now let's move on to hair from guides. This operator generates hair based on the data from the guides. And just like the guides from mesh operator, you get the distribution options to control the way roots are distributed over the mesh. And render count indicates the number of hair strands generated on the mesh right now. So which means by default, it generates 10,000 hair strands. So the viewport count fraction controls how many hair strands are shown in the viewport. So right now it's showing a fraction of 0.1 of 10,000 hair strands in the viewport. So if I set this to 1, that basically shows all the 10,000 hair strands in the viewport. I usually set the viewport count to 1 to check the groom before I do a test render, because having it at value 1 could be expensive for the viewport to handle, resulting in a sluggish performance from the viewport. So I'm going to set it back to 0.1. We talked about distribution multiplier before, but I said that we will be using the 1 in this operator, not the 1 in guides from mesh. So now if I create a checkered pattern here, as you can see, it basically masked out the black parts of the mask, and it's only generating the hair from the white parts of the texture. So you can bring in a custom mask and connect it to a distribution multiplier to define where the hair needs to be generated on the mesh. So under root displacement, you can connect your displacement map to your displacement multiplier to make the hair follow the displacement in your render. And all the other options that we have in here, they can be left alone as default. So from here on, we will be adding other operators to refine the groom, basically anything to make the hair look realistic or close to the reference that we are going for. So we already have curl and frizz assigned to two other groups. I'm going to delete these for now. I'm going to comb the hair a little bit. So I'm going to go to edit guides and select the comb brush. And I'm going to move the guides around. So I'm going to add length, randomize the length size. So as you can see, it randomized the length of the hair, which looks much better. So here you can see a value channel, which is set to none by default. So you can create a map to control the length of the hair and also the thickness of the hair. So we will be using those maps later when we start grooming a character. For now, I'm going to skip this option here. Under length operator, the only value you would be using the most would be just the randomize option. And then I'm going to create clump. And by default, it creates 50 clumps. And if you want more, you can just increase the number to 1000 and then click on create clumps. But that's way too many, so I'm going to reduce it back to 200. There you go. Maybe a little bit more. Yeah. You can always switch off your operators if you want to by clicking on the light bulb icon here to see how much that operator is affecting your hair groom. And then you also have flyaway fraction and amount. So I'm going to reduce the clump count a little bit so that we can see what the flyaway fraction and amount is actually doing to the clumps. So I'm going to set it back to 12. And click on create clumps. Then, as you can see, flyaway amount is basically pushing few of the hair strands away. And if you have it at 1, everything is just a cone. If you want that, and if you're going for like Dragon Ball Z hair, sure, you can do that. And if you want it to look much more natural and realistic, I would push few hair strands away, because imperfection is what gives your character much more believability. And fraction is basically controlling how many strands are pushed out. So I'm going to increase the number of clump count now. So I'm going to set it to 300. Create clumps. There you go. And then moving on to curl. We have 2 different wave options. So you can reduce the magnitude on that, or you can control it using the ramp. On any ramp in Ornatrix, the left indicates the root and the right indicates the tip of the hair. So I'm going to reduce the clamp magnitude on the tip as well, and a little bit at the center. And I'm going to change the noise amount as well. So adding curl really brings out how low res our hair strands are, because we are only using 10 vertices per each guide. So the hair strands doesn't have enough resolution to get that smooth curvature, which shouldn't be a problem because we have another operator called detail. So we're gonna deal with that later once we go through all the other operators here. So I'm gonna add some frizz to it, and I'm gonna reduce the amount, and then also at the tips a little bit. Fraction controls what fraction of hair is affected by this value, and amount is basically adding that outlier value to those strands. So it's basically pushing the strands away from the surface. And here we can see there are a few strands that are actually going through the surface, and that's not really good. Actually, there is an easy fix for that. Add a push away from surface operator. And you can add a collision mesh to it, but right now I'm not going to add the sphere because we already have collide with distribution mesh option switched on. If you have multiple objects that you want the hair to interact with, then only then I would add those meshes into the collision list. So now we need the detail on each of these strands so that it looks much better. So I'm going to go add the detail operator. Under viewport count, as you can see, it is set by default to 10 and 10, which is the exact number of vertex count that we had set in the guides from mesh. Right here, point count. It's really good that they provide you with 2 options, one for the viewpoint count and the render point count, which means viewpoint count is adding detail to the viewport. But that detail won't be shown in the render because the render point count is set to 10. So that you want to either match with the viewpoint count, or you can even make it higher. It doesn't have to be the same. And you can also add smoothing amount. Now that we've covered the necessary tools and operators to get started, we are going to move on to the next chapter.